to Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. In this show, we dig into the societal upheavals in recent U.S. history that have left so many feeling lost, angry, or hopeless, and explore how our nation became so unmoored. At the heart of this upheaval is a major debate over how to build a society where everyone can thrive. Our host is history professor and theologian Carl Kreisman. Joining Carl is Matthew Porter, a writer, director, and creative executive.
Hey, Matthew.
Hey, Carl.
How are you?
I am grand. Looking forward to doing this again.
Good. We are in episode 3 of Unmoored, and we are examining my contention that the United States society and culture is in some version of peril. That, to use the phrase, unmoored, we're unmoored from the safety and the protection of a good harbor, of a kind of a dock, stable foundation. And at the center of this lies our decades-long, certainly since World War II, I would say, decline of historical awareness. In other words, a sense of we lose our history is beneficial to us, can both guide us as to what was done before, but also how to go forward. And we'll really try to make sure we always kind of tap into that at most episodes, every episode really. We're going to go deeper in history. In case you're wondering, what the first 2 episodes may not have felt as much into the history, we are going to get there, I promise you.
And I'm looking forward to this one. I think it's always going to be entertaining and always informative and always challenging. But I have a prediction that this one's going to tick off some people. And I hope they'll stick around because maybe they should be ticked off a little bit. But, I hope that intrigues somebody because I think we're going there with this episode.
Well, we will see. What we hope happens through this episode, not just this episode, but all the whole series really, is to rediscover certain key historical truths that can guide us, if not backwards, because I understand people going, I don't want to go backwards, but the idea back to safe harbor, but forwards to a safe harbor. How do we do that? What's the right way to do that? And we talked last time about foundation and about how that's necessary, but in particular, it's necessary for a civic structure like we are engaged in, and that history is a guide. I said this last time. I'm a huge Tolkien fan, so I was reading a new book on Tolkien and kind of his underlying philosophy. And in Lord of the Rings alone, according to this expert, all right, Peter Kreeft, he says that there are over 500 references within Lord of the Rings, so the 3-volume set, which is actually 1-volume set, but was published in 3 volumes, to that land's history. So if you know Tolkien, he wrote another book called The Silmarillion, and that's really kind of the history. And then there's all kinds of other writings that Tolkien's son Christopher ultimately published. If you've gone to a bookstore and you look for Tolkien writings, there are dozens and dozens of different books, and they're all about the history that is behind the scenes of Lord of the Rings. So Kreeft writes this: Tolkien's heroes are humble and therefore look to the past, to the wisdom they had been given. His villains and fools are proud and therefore scorn tradition and look only within themselves for their wisdom. And if you review Tolkien just from this point of history, you see this again and again and again, where Gandalf and Aragorn and Frodo and Bilbo and Legolas, they're always talking about what lessons they learned from the past, failures from the past, how to correct things, how the past can guide them. Whereas the other guys who are the bad guys, they're not looking to the past. And, it's my contention that this is important for us to learn how to operate together. And that's really the point, is to operate together. I think we said in the first episode, we're trying to think of the idea of a common good, right? That a society that works well as best as possible. I don't want to set out a utopic vision and say a society that works 100% of the time, excellent for 100% of the people, because that's not fair to real life. I'm not suggesting that. Certainly, I'm someone who can point to moments, even recent in my life, where I feel like things were not good or not well, but that's not the country's fault.
Yeah.
Right? So just saying that there's an opportunity for flourishing for every individual. And this gets into kind of how we interface with each other.
Yeah. I think you made an important distinction there just in passing, that looking back at the past is not just hearkening back to some golden age when everything was great and let's do what we need to do to get back there. It's looking back to both the good and the bad and being informed by both.
Yeah.
So it's forward looking, but it's towards the end of moving, or it's looking backwards, but it's towards the end of moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I have mentors who matter to me, and 10 years ago, I was in a conversation with one of my mentors, a really important, very learned man, and we were talking about how to have good interactions. So sort of the idea is as you go into this episode or through all the episodes, and I'm maybe saying something that's controversial, like where's my heart and hope for you, and then as the listener. And so we'd been talking about the King Arthur legend, the idea of the round table, that everyone equal at the table. And I said in an exchange with him, I said that it's important, and I realized as he and I were sharing that I have to admit, and I may not know best, and thus to find, quote unquote, the best, I need to be willing to listen, and to listen with courtesy and honest engagement. Well, when I said courtesy, his eyes kind of lit up again. He's well learned. He knows his Latin far better than I do. And my point was not saying just be courteous to, I don't know, listen silently, but listening is not preparing my own devastating reply. Listening is seeking to hear. Even if in the end I don't agree, I want to seek to hear. There's an honor kind of that goes at that point.
Yeah.
Well, so then he goes, well, I love the root of that word courtesy, and I'm probably not going to pronounce it correctly. He did. But in Latin, it's cur, C-O-U-E-R, which is heart. And he said, genuine courtesy isn't good manners, but a good heart toward others. I love that.
That really changes the tenor of that word.
Right. And at the end of the first episode, I said to everyone, and I think this is still kind of an important aspect for me, is that in my opinion, no one is seeking to actually do harm to others. No one is thinking, I hate everybody else. That there is a sense of wanting best, and we disagree, and because some people disagree very deeply, they've taken divergent paths, and then those can become conflict-oriented, and conflict can come out, and there are things that we see in time and space where someone does do harm to another. But in general terms, I think people listening and in the country, they do want there to be a good heart towards others. Now, this links me back to Tolkien. So was reading again Kreeft, and he noted in this idea that Tolkien was writing to Christopher, his son, and Tolkien said, quote, the romantic chivalric tradition can be very good since it takes fidelity, and then that takes self-denial, service, courtesy, there's that word again, honor and courage. And the point of this, I point this out, is just to say there are old values that become central to good virtue and morality. And of course, I've said we're going to look today in particular digging into Christianity. We're going to look at Christians and some of the positions that are taken. And then the next episode, we're going to dig even deeper into historical documents that can give us insight. And so some people listening, particularly if they know that I'm a 40-year theologian, pastor, minister, as well as a historian, can think that my approach is to say Christianity only, Christianity always, that basically the only solution for this common good for everybody is for everybody to become a Christian. Well, Carl personally may wish for someone to get to know Jesus like I know them, but that's not actually my position as it comes to thinking how does the civic society operate going forward. So there's some issues with that. But so I bring these up of these old medieval concepts which weren't really Christian in a broad sense, that there's other ways to find virtue, and we'll need to figure that out, not in this podcast, but as a society. It is, though, to say that courtesy, as an example, is not what someone would necessarily think of as a Christian concept, but that's an example of a civic virtue that I'm going to be, back to what my mentor said, someone with a good heart towards others, including those who I may disagree with. So there's kind of some depth there. I think it's useful.
I think it is. I think really listening to somebody is it's almost a holy act, kind of, in a way. If you've ever needed to talk to somebody and just be heard, not just a conversation, and I have experienced that, where I just have a story, and I just need you to hear it. And this person did, and just asked questions at the right times, but mostly just kept listening and inviting more input. It was it was profound. I mean, it was a deeply moving thing for what I needed right there. So I think there's a lot of dignity that you recognize when you're doing that for somebody.
Yeah, and I think you saying that is a good segue or a jump back to last episode. When we ended the last episode, I was trying to stress that for me, these problems we are facing are of a spiritual nature. We're not going to solve these problems with an election. We're not going to solve these problems by what policies are chosen. Like if I can get the right policies chosen, that solves the problem. But that these are really at a deep kind of spiritual level. As you thought back to episode 2, and as we segue in, did that all make sense last time, or is there any part of that you felt like you needed to raise again or wanted us to talk about?
Yeah, I think we kind of covered it as far as setting the table for where we're headed with this thing, and as you said earlier, don't get ahead of us here. It's almost like Lewis's Mere Christianity. He's like, I'm going somewhere, but don't get ahead of me, because I'm going to go probably in a different direction than you think, and a different pace than you think. So
right,
please do stick with us on this.
Yeah, in fact, that there may be somebody listening who wants me to defend the case, say, of Christianity as the default best virtue, which, again, for my listeners of all stripes, that is what my position, but that's really a different podcast. We may make this a season 2 that you and I touch on, where we kind of dig into that. But for now, all I'm trying to do again is raise the point that we're lost at sea. We're unmoored.
Yeah.
We aren't listening to our history, and we are unaware that there should be a foundation. And then the link we're going to be moving towards is that the founders of this country had that foundation. They had it, and we referenced some founders last time, kind of raising the point that they saw this as a critical need. And we talked about how, because of this system of civic governance. Now, look, if we want to move to a dictatorship, and I use that as that's maybe use a different phrase. If we want to use to a top-down power of all agency, only at the top levels of kind of a national or government of some type, well, then fine. Well, then we don't need a system of virtues, because, as we described last time in depth, we won't have the need for that. But if we're really going to still lean into a sense of the liberty of the individual to largely be able to do what she feels like she wants to do at any given moment, then the only way for this system to work is one in which the individuals can trust each other, and that's at a spiritual, deep level. So that's kind of where we are in the argument. Well, then that takes us really to transitioning deeper into this episode, because if we are at a tension between peoples, maybe the question next is the who. And this is where I kind of want to raise, it's my contention that if you were looking at this like as a play or a TV show, the two key characters that are in tension with one another is the Christian, or maybe the conservative Christian, because certainly I think that Christianity, as many groupings of people, have different flavors or different variations on it. But there's a group of individuals who claim the name of Jesus Christ as their central ethos, and we call them Christians. I am one of those people also. But there's a section of that group that is determined to, they would say, probably save the soul of the country, or create a mechanism that would allow for their version of like a best flourishing. And then the second character is the person who thinks that's a terrible idea. There's a group of people kind of pushing back. And so these two groups really stand at the center of tension. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the Christians, the conservative Christians, I'm going to struggle. I don't like labels, and so I struggle with that, whether it's progressive or liberal or conservative or those kinds of labels, because they're never really complete. They're always very broad, and yet immediately, as soon as you throw a broad label on, people are kind of like, well, that's not me. But anyway, so I'm going to struggle here. Sorry, audience. I'm going to struggle back and forth here.
Mm-hmm.
But they're basically... in very simplistic terms, confessing myself, there's the Christian who looks at what they really looked at, where this really begins, is late 70s into the early 80s. Some would argue early 70s, but with individuals looking at the changes that were happening in our society on a cultural level through the 60s into the 70s, that they would say were bad for society, and certainly were a movement away from their view of the normative good for the country. They'd call these things progressive or liberal or radical, and it shows up in a lot of variety of different ways. And some of you may have studied the 60s and early 70s to know the different things that are out there, and so that they would say that and this group would then say the success of the nation depends on an adherence to the Christian God, which was fundamental at the beginning of the founding of the country. And then the other groups, who are not all non-Christians, but largely there's a large percentage, I think, who would probably be non-Christian, who would think that the insistence or the pursuit of insistence on Christian principles, that's actually what causes chaos and a negative, right? That there's a negative that works out there. And my position that I'm trying to say is both of these groups have lost the plot, have gone awry, have forgotten their history, or maybe more fairly, have misinterpreted history, misinterpreted away from what the actual evidence that we have tells us. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. So let's dig into these. We're going to start with who are the Christians. So now, sometimes the phrase will be used about Christian nationalism. Let me just maybe give a definition here really quickly, because we're not focusing on Christian nationalism, but I think a lot of things that I'm going to talk about, or that this group talks about, to the second character, the progressive character, it sounds like Christian nationalism. I think many of the conservative Christians would say, no, that's not what I mean, but it just feels that way. It kind of leans into this idea that either everybody should be Christian, or every political decision or every governing decision needs to be at least in an alignment with Christian teaching, if not Christian on the face. You can see that in some aspects. For instance, when people might say that the Ten Commandments should be in every school, or should be in every judge's courthouse, kind of a thing. And that would make sense if you were in a country where 100% of the residents were Christian, and the governing documents were structured in a way that Christianity was like maybe the very first thing stated. That's not our country. But to pursue that, particularly if you're someone who's not a Christian, so whether you're religious or not, you may be religious, but you're not certainly a Christian or not a conservative Christian in this alignment, that feels oppressive or restrained. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so this group will say a version of things have gone badly because of a movement away from Christianity. To them, there's something that's been done to them, something they think that's ruinous. And I would just suggest, and we're going to dig on this for at least the next couple of episodes, that what's really happening here is that this group is awakening to the fact of what has been true for probably the past 30 years, that they are the minority culture in this society. And so they're awakening to this and not liking the fact that they are now in the minority as when they look at culture. That when they talk about, I'm trying to avoid using any specifics, just not to inflame anybody, but an easy one would be marriage. Right? So when they hear conversation about what marriage is or should be, they're awakening to the fact that when they talk about what they perceive Christian marriage is, so a lifetime commitment between a man and a woman, that's not the majority accepted viewpoint. It may be the goal for some people who don't claim to be Christians, but if that doesn't happen, the lifetime aspect or the man and woman aspect, the Christians are frustrated that this is no longer seen as the normal position.
Right.
So it kind of gets to them. And I think it's fair to say that they only now realize they're in the minority is fair, because when you take the stats and you go back to the 1950s, the research that we have from the various groups like Gallup and others who look at the research at that time, that within the time of the 50s, on research response, roughly 90% of the country claimed a religious adherence, and probably 85% of that number would claim to be Christians. And then most of them were going to church. So they were faithful in adherence to these activities. In other words,
Right.
what does a Christian do? Well, they go to church, they read their Bible, they give some money to a church, they participate in activities at the church, and there's obviously somebody who's there all the time and the doors are open. There's somebody who's there casually. There are people who are on a roll but don't ever come. But this is a group of people of which said, yes, I am one of these people, and here's where I go to church, and they do go at least maybe twice a month. I mean, that's a pretty good adherence.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time you go down in time, so you move through time through the 80s and 90s, the attendance plummets. So I guess the thing I would say in broad terms, before we dig a little more into this, is that if this group in 2024 perceives that something has happened to them, this is where they're wrong. Because if the society moved off of a certain position, whatever it might be, you can take another look at, say, drug usage. In yours and my lifetime, drug usage has gone from illegal to sort of accepted to now, with marijuana usage, openly legal.
Completely mainstream.
You find it in every corner in America, or every city in America, many cities in America. You can find more than one place to buy a version of marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying whether you should or shouldn't. I would suggest it's not helpful, so you probably shouldn't, but there are medical reasons why people consider it could be good.
Yeah.
But just that movement, right? If you look at these changes, the group that had to have moved were the Christians themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean that's just a mathematical thing, right? I mean, like the vast preponderance are saying, "Hey, we're here." Like, okay, well, most of you guys are still here, but now the locus has moved dramatically in a different direction. You're like, it ain't them.
Yeah.
You don't want to hear it, but you know.
Yeah, when I grew up, I think the easy target for the church where I was at and people that I knew was Hollywood. We were in a very small rural town. And so there's kind of a sense of it's like they're doing something to us. And sure, media, so radio, TV, Hollywood, movies, they certainly can have an outsized influence, larger than their numbers. But if in general sense 90% of the country believed in these normative, quote-unquote Christian values, say about drug usage or about marriage continuity, right? And then that shifted. What has to have happened mathematically is that people who claimed something themselves did not adhere to what they claimed. There's just, and this is the part I think many Christians, when I talk to, they get really annoyed with me when I point this stuff out, because they want it. It's easier for there to be an enemy who has attacked me rather than to accept the enemy within.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We need a narrative, right? And certain ones are easier to embrace, and us versus them always feels super cozy. Listen
to some of these stats. These stats are damning. These are kind of connected to 2024. Let's say early 21st century, right? 75% attendance amongst the children of the 50s, who are the boomers, 30% attendance. By the time you get to our generation, Gen X, you and I, and then the younger people, even in the 90s, attendance had dropped to 20%. Even amongst people who self-proclaim themselves as conservative Christians, or to use the cute term which bugs me a lot, evangelicals, They also, by 2010, had seen a decline, not as steep from a number point of view. So our self-proclaimed conservatives were higher than every other group of Christians, but it had still dropped by almost 20%. By 22%, all religious affiliation had fallen to 65%. So up to 90% in the 50s, down to nearly 60% by 2022. And at the same time, a corresponding group had risen, which I know on some of the work you've done with your where you're the executive producer of the radio show. You've talked about this before. Is that this group has risen who now answers none, N-O-N-E. So if you take the group that says none, you take the atheists, you take the agnostics, it's roughly 30% of society. Which, okay, whatever, good or bad, but just when you look and say, oh wow, that's a significant change in the process. The nuns, there's been research done on who these people are. And one of the most damning things for the Christian conservative group is that when you ask these people, explain what's going on for them, it's not, oh, I've decided I'm an atheist, because they could answer they're an atheist.
Right.
They usually answer that they are rejecting the lifestyle that they've seen in other people who proclaim this. In other words, I see the way these people are living who have claimed this thing that I too have claimed, and now I reject that.
Yeah. I'm spiritual, not religious.
Yeah, that's one of the big words.
That's a lot of people would check that box.
And this ought to concern anyone listening who says, oh, wait, I claim Jesus as my faith position. Okay, groovy, check this one out. 84% of surveyed young adults, so this is, say, 30 and unders, admitted that they knew a committed Christian. So in other words, there was a survey done. Do you know somebody who claims to be a committed Christian? Yep. Okay, they did. So 84% of the surveyed people said, yeah, I know somebody. That's a large group saying, yeah, I know somebody. Only 15% of those young people said within the Christian they knew, somebody that was, again, by the survey metric, a committed Christian, that they could see a difference in the lifestyle of themselves versus the Christian.
Wow.
That's brutal.
That is rough.
Self-reported by Christians confirms this, that they themselves often see no difference in their lifestyle or of other Christians they know in actions like lying, using angry language, gambling. I know gambling's another example of how we've kind of moved off of what was traditional to now you can't watch a sporting event without being encouraged to gamble.
Right.
But for a committed Christian, gambling is kind of a no-go area. Pornography usage. So in other words, here you have this group of people who say, I proclaim a certain viewpoint. Now again, I'm not trying to say whether they are or they are not a Christian. I'm not trying to hold them to account or criticize them. I'm just pointing out to this first character who says, hey, the country's in peril. It's these progressives who have ruined things, and we are trying to save the country by calling it back to faith. To say to them, if anybody moved, it was you guys. If anybody has not stayed consistent with the viewpoint, it's you guys.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so damning to the position. Do you remember I said to you one of our major problems, and in fact, I would probably say it's the greatest example of what the problem is that we have an addiction to ease and comfort, luxury. There are many faith positions, and many of them will call for self-moderation. In this country, 85% or so were Christians. So does the Christian life view call for self-moderation on both just general lifestyle and on economic means? Yes, it clearly does. So one would imagine that if there was a problem with consumerism and a pursuit of excess financially, it wouldn't happen within the Christian. So there'd be this small percentage of Americans who were non-Christian who were pursuing this over these 80 or so odd years we're talking about since World War II. But instead, that's not what you see. Instead, what you see are, unfortunately, churches that spend millions of dollars on large buildings and large salaries, and they seem to be worshiping at an altar of consumerism and power. They seem to have elevated leaders, speakers, musicians to kind of an idol status, which that's a big no-no, as we're going to talk about later. The problem for the Christian church in America is that it has become enculturated so that there's no difference between it and the rest of the culture around it. And on any superficial glance at the historical documents that the Christians hold up as the core philosophy, the thing we call the Bible, you look at that, and what their God, the God of the Bible, is calling for is an alternative worldview, almost a different way of being human.
Yeah. If somebody were living a Christian life, it's not like us just like a regular person, just, a little bit nicer. They're going to be fundamentally out of phase with the rest of the culture. They might get along okay, with people, and they're not outcasts, but noticeably different. Not in that 15%, or whichever.
No, you're right. Yeah, 15%.
Yeah, you'd be the ones that you're like, yeah, and he backs that up.
Yeah, it's always troubling to me, and I've had the privilege of having this been said to me by a few people who are not Christians. Some version of you, Carl, are the only Christian I've ever met.
Wow.
And it's honoring, and at the same time it's humbling, but it's also tragic, because I'm certain that they've interfaced with other people who claim Christianity. And so this is this idea of becoming so enculturated. So what do we need? We need to become disenculturated. We need to find a difference. So we're not two solutions yet, but we're just kind of pointing out who the characters are. But if you're a Christian and you're thinking you want to save the country, let me just suggest to you that you need to have a personal inventory of your life kind of connected to the viewpoint of what you say Jesus calls to, and to disenculturate yourself. And when I say that, that is to think of separating the cultural trappings that have been added on to kind of Christian life, or what happens at your church, or the teachings that you believe in, from the core historic Christian teachings, the very things God says he wants and expects from his people. And it's a hard message, and like you said at the beginning, some people may not like me being the one to say it, but I think we have to own it. We said in both the first two episodes, we were trying not to approach this from a triumphalist viewpoint or an arrogant viewpoint.
Right.
As a Christian, that is an easy charge against my group, that your approach to society is one of an arrogance that has the finger pointed outwards. And as the old joke says, when you point the finger out, you actually have three pointed back. And of course, Jesus, if you know any of Jesus' teaching, you've probably heard this one. Hey, don't worry about the speck that's in your brother's eye. You got a problem in your own eye. And this is that concept. I'm not saying you can't have an opinion about what's going on in society. I'm obviously offering one now in this podcast, but I am saying that the data is, to me, full and clear that the issue is not an external thing that's happened to the conservative Christian, but that the Christians themselves have failed to live up to the very thing that they say they believe in. And if they want to try to fix that, we got to start there.
Yeah. And even though this is kind of provocative, that idea of disenculturation, I don't think anybody can argue that there might be value in pausing and looking at what you do and what you believe and go, okay, is this culture, is this tradition, or is this the core of what I understand the Bible to say? And not even like saying that the culture or tradition are bad, but just kind of pulling them apart and kind of untangling them and seeing which is in which category. I think there's a lot of value in that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's switch to the other character, because they're not, innocent of action, or they need to be at least discussed in a sense. Now, for me, this group really picks up speed coming out of the 80s when the moral majority begins speaking. In other words, I think you could loosely say if this group existed as an individual character, they were happy with things in the 60s and 70s, broadly stated, with the changes that were taking place. But they started really getting amped up in a response to, and again, laying out the thesis again, there's a central group, there's the Christian conservative group that is saying, oh, things have gone bad and we need to stand against this. And this really kind of starts in the 80s, builds up speed in the 90s. And then in response to these efforts to return to what they would say a traditional viewpoint or the historic viewpoint, they might even say, this other group has said, whoa, wait a minute. And they would respond in concern or alarm with how things are being done and presented. And so they're like, hey, the direction we're going is good, right? But the problem with this is that I would suggest this group is now coming to grips with, as we sit here in the early 21st century, that a bigger issue is the failure of the Enlightenment project. So if you think of the Enlightenment project as something as the victory of rationality and reason over dogma, spirituality, they would even say mythic, those kinds of ideas that really begins with the Renaissance and say the 1500s and kind of moving forward till we come to the period historians call the Enlightenment, and that you can see, there's this progress that takes us forward, and that sort of there's a victory of rationality in how we kind of makes decisions. But the problem with this is that when we look at the evidence that has occurred over these past, say, 3 or 4 centuries, is that we don't actually see that kind of progress. I mean, we see some progress in terms of like we jokingly said last time, or one of the times, we have air conditioning. But even if you look and say, we have cars, we have air conditioning, now it seems kind of clear that those might be problems with the situations happening to the environment. And so you realize something that even that we claim as a progress might actually be problematic. And it raises the question of can, we actually even think of the human as a species advancing. And where the Enlightenment, I think, so the Enlightenment kind of enshrined some positions. So you could state these positions. Ian McGilchrist, in his book, The Master and the Emissary, kind of nails these out. But and he would say, and I agree with him, that these are actually obviously false. But the position they would take is, well, all genuine questions can be answered. If there's not an answer, there's not a real question. All the answers are discoverable by the human because the human has this capacity. And all these answers are compatible with each other. And then this builds kind of a fable of science versus religion. And when you see science versus religion connected to the Enlightenment, it is almost always really science versus Christianity. Now, there's a whole other conversation, which we don't have time for, about how most of the scientists from the quote-unquote scientific revolution were actually very faithful Christians, and they believed that they could discover things because they believed in an ordered, designed world that had discoverable elements. But I'll just leave that there for now. The myth of a unity of science, that there's only one logical path to knowledge. And I guess the point I want to make is that they believe that human history is kind of a record of general progress. You hear this all often from people, that there's an arc to history, or there's a direction for history. And the reality is that that's inaccurate, that's not the story when you look at the historical record. When you look at antiquity, really what you discover is that the human is much the same. There's heroes and villains. There's moments of brilliance and moments of darkness. There's technological understanding and know-how from some of our earliest historical societies. In some cases, things that we still either now are just figuring out or had lost and rediscovered, so that we rediscovered it. We're not brilliant. We're just catching up to where folks were 4,000 years ago. And when you then kind of position that idea, particularly the idea that the human is in a process of progress, things are getting better, this actually is like a historical blindness, because what history shows us in detail is that, as a species, we've actually changed relatively little. And then when you look at the excesses of particularly the 20th century, the 20th century stands out as really our most brutal century in human history. And the 20th century could arguably be called the first century without religion. Now, I'd have to really tease that out, and I could understand if somebody would push back and say, no, you just said in America 90% of people were Christians. But if you go globally, and certainly, maybe I should say differently, if you go from a European perspective, there clearly was a sense in which we have arrived at a moment where we can use rationality and kind of let religion just be in a little corner. Maybe it's an individual thing, and through our rationality and our knowledge, we will gain superiority and then create this kind of utopic vision, for everybody. C.S. Lewis calls this chronological snobbery, and he says that this assumption the assumption that whatever has gone out of date is on that account discredited. And clearly, things have not gotten better. And I think this is part of where the churn comes, particularly for younger people. So millennials and Gen Z, I guess we will call them, but the, say, 35 and under crowd, is that they see that there's not things better. Yes, they might think part of the problem is these Christians who are still arguing for a traditional or older viewpoint. But I think many of them also recognize that where we've landed has not solved anything, even as we moved into a postmodern society in which, well, I can kind of create my own truth and anything is real. As we said day one in our first session, all we have is greater depression, greater suicide, greater sense of disillusionment, greater sense of no hope, a hopelessness that kind of overwhelms, and they're just kind of going, well, gosh, the Christian thing must be wrong, but the Enlightenment thing must be wrong. We've not ended up anywhere really good.
Yeah.
That's a lot there I've kind of thrown at you. Any thoughts or questions about that? Or
Yeah, I think that bears out. I mean, the younger kids, I think what I see in them, and again, like you said, 35 and younger, so it covers quite a gamut. Even though they're young, kind of seeing things with clear eyes, as to like, this is not working. And I'm not necessarily loyal to this group or that credo or whatever, but I can objectively say what y'all doing is not working. And a logical conclusion, like you said, from there is, well, religion didn't work. And in reality, it's kind of a bad take on quote unquote religion that they might be casting off. But yeah, like you said, the postmodern view, my truth is my truth. You're like, well, just follow that down a couple steps. You can understand that goes nowhere. It's a cul-de-sac. So yeah, I feel like there's a whole generation of people going, well, what do we got?
And this ultimately ties into Nietzsche's view. In other words, as he correctly predicted, in a society where God is dead, and he famously said God is dead. And again, one could argue, well, the 20th century, there still was a lot of religion or a lot of Christianity if you want to. But if you take the Nietzsche view that we've killed God, Nietzsche was, people don't realize this, I think many people, is that he deeply took the Enlightenment to task. In that he was saying what I just said, although he said it far more eloquently than I just said. And that you end up in a place where, as he suggested, there should be the superhuman or the superman, which of course the Germans latched onto this, and it's not fair to call Nietzsche some kind of a proto-Nazi, but they latched onto this idea. But it's not a Enlightenment good for all. It's that there's no rules, and then the only thing that should matter is the powerful should dominate. And if I want to live in that world, okay, go for it. But if I want to live in a world where there is a common good for flourishing for all people, well, this again would be, well, I can't go on that path.
Right.
And I think when you look at the 20th century, and I don't mean just the wars, I mean the arrival of ideas, ideologies, and even nations or places that promoted those views. And then you look at life in those places, not with war, just how was life lived? You see brutality, you see exile, you see destruction. You do not see flourishing.
Yeah, and to this idea of man is perfectible, you're like, wow, it's a very attractive idea. It doesn't bear out, obviously, but if man is perfectible, then anything that's standing in my way of advancing us should be eradicated by that morality. Anything that's counter to us moving this thing forward towards somebody who's perfect, well, you're evil. You need to be dealt with, and we've seen that. We've seen what that looks like here and abroad.
Yeah, absolutely. I tell people a lot of times that one of the very few things you can go through human history and find an agreement on amongst people, places, tribes, and groups is, what do you do with evil? Will you eliminate evil? But if I'm able to say anybody who doesn't agree with my worldview is evil, well, then all you've done is open the Pandora's box for destruction, death, and kind of elimination of all, which then just becomes back to, as we said last time, a might makes right kind of position. And that's a dark world to live in.
Yeah, there's nobody who has followed a utopian vision that did not end up with a trail of bodies behind them.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a tested idea.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is great about what you're saying, where you're like, okay, look, personally, my beliefs, I think everything would be much better if we all kind of believed this set of beliefs. But that said, same sentence, there is a path forward, a positive, workable path forward that involves that in a scenario where we still all believe a whole bunch of stuff. That's very interesting.
Yeah. There's two groups of people. No one group or person is to blame. There's obviously more groups of people. You can divide the tensions in the United States maybe in other slices. But I feel this is fair. And again, this is kind of my focus for my thesis, my generating idea. And I guess maybe I should say it this way. I am a Christian. So instead of it looking outwardly, I'm looking inwardly. And I'm recognizing we have some issues. But in broad terms, no one's to blame, or we're all to blame. The solution doesn't mean that one group needs to change. We all have lessons to learn, and again, from history. And what we're going to point out next time is that this is not the first time this has happened. When there has been a group of people who believed they were kind of God's chosen people or the people of God, and who were the majority culture someplace. And then it all went sour in seemingly an instant, took longer than an instant. And they were, by their own writings, their own history, we're going to look at their historical documents, they were abandoned and turned over to their enemies and suddenly found themselves in exile where they were the minority culture. And so we want to dig into that and see what lessons can we learn. This will be particularly true if you are a Christian, but hopefully everybody will come along for the ride, because we want to see what is it like if you have a certain faith position that was once majority and then it's in a minority. How does it operate? What should we look for from this group of people? And that's kind of what we're going to look at next time as we go further in our podcast on the Unmoored.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks for joining us on Unmoored, America Adrift in Historical Forgetfulness and Finding Our Way Back. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. If you have any questions or comments, drop an email to carl@carlkreisman.com. This episode was produced and edited by Carl Kreisman and recorded at the Winter Park Public Library. The Winter Park Library promotes the free and open exchange of ideas and does not attempt to control or take responsibility for any opinions that may be expressed in this podcast. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not constitute or imply an endorsement or reflection of the library's policies or beliefs. Our theme music was written and performed by Kyle Williams. A big thank you to everyone who supports the show. And if you'd like to help, visit carlkreisman.com/unmoored.